Welcome to our deep dive, and today we're tackling something pretty fundamental for anyone who's serious about learning effectively. It's all about developing those really powerful learning habits. And we're going to be focusing in on routine and discipline. We've got a really interesting mix of sources for this one. We've got articles that dig into the science behind habit formation. We've got some research that looks at just how much discipline actually impacts learning outcomes, and even some practical advice from real experts out there. So our mission today is to kind of unpack all of this, see if we can understand those key principles behind building really solid learning habits that stick. And then, of course, the part you can actually use, we'll figure out how to apply those principles to your own life, whether you're a student or professional or just someone who, loves learning new things.
Yeah, and it's really remarkable how much we've learned about, the brain and learning in just the last few years. I mean, we know now that our brains are incredibly adaptable,
Right.
that we can rewire them, through consistent effort and practice.
It's so empowering, right? I mean, it means that we're not stuck with whatever learning habits we have now. We can actually change them and become way more effective learners if we're willing to put in the work.
Exactly. And one of the most important things we've learned is the power of routine. When we establish these regular learning routines, we create a structure that really supports our learning goals.
Yeah, it's almost like creating a mental roadmap, you know,
Mm-hmm.
that guides us through the entire learning process.
Exactly. And the routine doesn't have to be rigid or, super complex. It's about finding that rhythm that works for you personally and then sticking to it as much as possible.
So you're creating those positive feedback loops where the act of learning itself becomes like a rewarding habit.
Exactly. Now let's talk about discipline. Discipline often has a negative connotation, but in the context of learning, it's incredibly empowering.
I think a lot of people hear discipline and they think restriction or punishment.
Right. But true discipline is about self-control and the ability to stay focused on your goals even when you don't really feel like it.
It's about that conscious choice to prioritize learning, even when there are a million distractions and temptations around.
Exactly. And this is where routine and discipline intersect to become so powerful.
Yeah, because when you combine that consistent routine with strong self-discipline, you create this like unstoppable force for learning.
Yeah, think of it like this. Routine provides the structure and discipline provides the fuel.
Together, they make this engine that drives us toward our learning goals.
And the great thing is that discipline, like any skill, can be developed over time.
So even if we don't think of ourselves as super disciplined right now, we can train ourselves to become more so.
Absolutely. And one of the best ways to do that is to start small. Don't try to change your whole life overnight. Instead, focus on building one small, achievable learning habit and just stick to it consistently.
Like what? Like committing to reading for 15 minutes every day or practicing a new language for like 10 minutes?
Exactly. Once that becomes second nature, you can gradually add more challenging habits.
It's like building muscle.
Yeah, you start with lighter weights and increase the resistance as you get stronger.
And that gradual approach is key because it prevents us from getting overwhelmed or discouraged.
Exactly. You want to set yourself up for success, not failure. So start small, be consistent, and celebrate your progress along the way.
Now let's get into some specific strategies for developing those really powerful learning habits.
One that's really effective is called habit stacking.
Oh, I've heard of that. It's where you link a new habit to an existing one, right?
Exactly. For example, if you already have a habit of drinking coffee every morning, you could stack the habit of reading for 15 minutes right after you finish your coffee.
So you're leveraging the existing, those neural pathways associated with the coffee habit to make it easier to establish the new reading habit.
Precisely. It's a clever way to kind of hack your brain and make habit formation almost effortless.
Another strategy that I've found really helpful is to create a dedicated learning space.
Yeah, having a designated area for learning can really help minimize distractions, and it creates a mental association between that space and the act of learning.
Yeah, it's like telling your brain, okay, time to switch into learning mode when you enter that space.
Exactly. And it doesn't have to be anything fancy or elaborate. It could be a desk in your bedroom, a corner in a coffee shop, even a comfy chair in your living room.
As long as it's a place where you feel comfortable and focused.
And make sure it's free of distractions.
No TV, no social media, no noisy roommates.
Right. We want to create an environment that's truly conducive to deep, focused learning.
Okay, so let's talk about motivation and its role in developing these learning habits.
Yeah, motivation is often seen as that key to success, but it can be a really fickle friend.
It's not always there when you need it.
Exactly. And relying on motivation alone to fuel your learning habits is a recipe for disaster.
Because it ebbs and flows, right?
Exactly. So what's the solution?
Well, I think it's about finding ways to tap into intrinsic motivation.
Intrinsic motivation being that motivation that comes from within.
Yeah, it's about finding the joy and satisfaction in the learning itself, not relying on external rewards or pressure.
And how do we cultivate that intrinsic motivation?
One really powerful way is to connect our learning goals to our values and passions.
Yeah, when we're learning something that aligns with our core beliefs and interests, we're much more likely to stay motivated and engaged.
Like finding that sweet spot where our intellectual curiosity intersects with our personal aspirations.
Exactly. Another way to boost intrinsic motivation is to set challenging but achievable goals. When we push ourselves a little beyond our comfort zone, we experience that sense of accomplishment and growth that makes us want to learn more.
It's like climbing a mountain.
Yeah, the challenge is part of the thrill.
And the view from the top is even more rewarding because of the effort we put in to get there.
Exactly. And the view from the top is even more rewarding because of the effort we put in to get there.
Absolutely. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about feedback, because feedback's essential for tracking our progress, identifying where we can improve, and staying motivated.
And it's not just about getting feedback from, teachers, mentors, or peers. We can also learn to provide ourselves with really effective feedback.
That's right. We can become our own learning coaches.
Exactly. One way to do this is to regularly review our work and really reflect on the learning process.
So asking ourselves questions like, what did I do well? Where can I improve? What strategies worked? What didn't?
Yeah, by honestly assessing our own performance, we can identify patterns and, adjust our learning habits accordingly.
It's like having this built-in feedback loop that helps us refine our approach to learning.
Exactly. And another powerful form of self-feedback is simply tracking our progress.
So using like a journal, a spreadsheet, or an app to track our learning activities and see how far we've come.
Yeah, because that visual representation of our progress can be incredibly motivating.
It's a reminder of our dedication and hard work.
And it can help us stay focused on those long-term learning goals.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about consistency, because I think that's really the heart of developing these strong learning habits.
It really is key. It's not about having perfect days. It's about showing up day after day, even when you don't feel like it.
Because those small, consistent efforts are what compound over time and produce those significant results.
Think of it like building a house. Each brick on its own is pretty insignificant, but when laid together carefully and with precision, they form a solid and lasting structure.
It's the same with learning.
Each study session, each practice session, each little act of learning might seem small in isolation, but over time, it accumulates and forms that foundation of knowledge, skills, and understanding. And that can last a lifetime.
So even if we only have like 15 minutes to spare, it's better to use that time to learn something new than just let it slip away.
Absolutely. It's about making learning a non-negotiable part of your daily routine.
Okay, so let's wrap up this part of our deep dive with some practical tips for actually incorporating these principles into our lives.
Sounds good. First, identify one specific learning habit that you want to develop.
Keep it small and achievable, something you can commit to every day, even if it's just for a few minutes.
Then create a specific plan for how you'll implement it.
So like, what time of day will you do it? Where will you do it? What resources do you need?
Having a clear plan removes all the ambiguity and makes it much easier to stick to that commitment.
Makes sense. What about obstacles or distractions? How do we deal with those?
Yeah, you got to identify those potential obstacles or distractions that might get in your way, and then come up with strategies to overcome them.
Okay, so like, if I know social media is my weakness, I turn off notifications
Yeah.
or use a website blocker.
Exactly. Or if you always feel sleepy after lunch, schedule your learning sessions for a different time.
Okay, that's a good point. What about accountability? Is that important?
Very important. Find a way to hold yourself accountable. Tell a friend about your goal. Track your progress in a journal. Maybe join an online learning community.
Having that external support can really make a difference.
It really can. And don't forget to celebrate those little successes along the way.
Yes, every little step forward, no matter how small, deserves to be recognized.
Exactly. Because when we celebrate our wins, we reinforce that positive feedback loop and make learning even more enjoyable and rewarding.
So we've talked about routine, discipline, feedback, consistency, even motivation. And now I want to touch on something that I think is often overlooked, the power of community.
Yeah, that's a great point. We often think of learning as this solitary pursuit, but having a supportive community can make all the difference.
Totally agree. whether it's a study group, an online forum, or even just a friend who shares our learning goals.
Yeah.
Having that sense of connection and accountability can keep us motivated and inspired.
Absolutely. It's like having this team of cheerleaders who encourage you when you stumble and celebrate with you when you succeed.
Love that analogy. This has been such a rich and insightful conversation. We've covered so much ground, but sadly, we're running out of time for this segment, so we'll be back for part 3, where we'll wrap things up with some practical takeaways and things you can actually start doing today. So stay tuned for the final part of our deep dive into developing powerful learning habits. All right, so welcome back to the deep dive for this final part of our, exploration into developing those really powerful learning habits. In this last section, we're going to move from, all the principles and theory into actually putting it all into action.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground, right?
Yeah.
We talked about the science of habit formation, tackling those common challenges, the importance of mindset and community. Now let's translate all that into some, actionable steps you can start using today.
Yeah, it's one thing to understand the theory, but it's another to actually put it into practice, right? That's where the real magic happens.
Okay.
So let's get into some specific strategies for, transforming these insights into lasting habits.
Okay, sounds good. Ready to get practical. So where do we begin?
Well, one of the most effective starting points is to really clarify your learning goals. What is it that you want to achieve? What knowledge or skills do you want to acquire? Having that clear destination in mind makes it so much easier to plan your route and stay motivated along the way.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like setting off on a journey with no idea where you're going. You're just going to wander around aimlessly and probably never reach your full potential.
Exactly. And once you have that clear sense of your goals, then you can start to break them down into smaller, manageable steps. And that's where the power of routine really comes in.
Okay, so we've talked about routine before, but I'm curious to hear more about, how we can actually integrate learning into our daily lives in a way that's actually sustainable.
It's all about finding ways to weave learning into the fabric of your existing routines. Like if you're a morning person, you might, set aside the first 30 minutes of your day for reading or practicing a skill. If you're more of a night owl, maybe block out an hour after dinner for online courses or language learning.
So it's not about, adding more hours to our already busy schedules. It's about finding those little pockets of time that we can repurpose for learning.
Exactly. It's about those small, consistent choices that add up over time. Even if you only have 15 minutes here and there, those minutes will become hours and days of learning if you just stick with it.
That's encouraging. It makes those busy days feel a little less overwhelming when you think about it that way. So what about technology? I mean, we're surrounded by all these apps and devices that promise to, enhance our learning.
Mm.
Are there any specific tools or platforms that you recommend?
Oh, there are tons of options out there. And technology can be super helpful, but it's important to be selective and not get distracted by all the hype. Focus on tools that align with your learning goals and your own personal preferences.
So if I'm someone who learns best visually, I might be drawn to platforms that offer more video-based courses or interactive simulations.
Exactly. And if you're more of an auditory learner, podcasts or audiobooks might be a better fit for you. It's all about experimenting and finding what works best for your individual learning style.
Okay, that's great advice.
Yeah.
It's so easy to get overwhelmed by all the choices. But if I just focus on what works for me, it feels a lot less daunting. So let's talk about the mental game. We talked about the importance of mindset earlier, but I'm curious to hear more about how we can train our brains to become more effective learners.
One powerful technique is practicing mindfulness, which means paying attention to the present moment without judgment. And this can help us become more aware of our thoughts, feelings, and even those distractions as they pop up.
So it's like developing that awareness of our own learning process.
Exactly. By becoming more mindful of how we learn, we can identify those patterns and make little adjustments to boost our focus and concentration.
It's like becoming a scientist of our own minds, right? Observing our thoughts and behaviors with curiosity and a willingness to experiment.
I love that analogy. And as you become more mindful, you can start incorporating techniques like, positive self-talk and visualization to really reinforce those learning goals and keep that motivation high.
Those are great strategies. It's so easy to get bogged down by, negative self-talk or doubt, but actually putting in the effort to cultivate positive thoughts and beliefs can make a huge difference.
Absolutely. And remember, learning is a journey, not a destination. There are going to be bumps along the way, but it's those challenges that make us stronger and more resilient learners in the long run.
That's such a good reminder. It's easy to get discouraged, when we hit those roadblocks. But if we can embrace those challenges as opportunities for growth, it helps us stay motivated and keep moving forward.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to remember? I think the most important message is that developing those powerful learning habits is a journey, not a sprint. It's about making small, consistent choices that align with your goals and what you enjoy. It's about seeing challenges as opportunities to grow and surrounding yourself with a supportive community. And above all, it's about finding that joy and satisfaction in the process of lifelong learning.
This has been such an insightful and inspiring conversation. Thank you so much for joining us on the deep dive. We hope you've gained some valuable insights and practical strategies to really empower you on your own learning journey.